Vladimir Putin will almost certainly secure his third decade in control of Russia this weekend.
Завтра, 15 марта, по всей нашей огромной стране.
The Russian president is heading to an election where he's expected to easily claim another 6-year term. Why is that? Well, the Kremlin has tight control over media in the country, where many of Putin's opponents are jailed, or in the case of Alexei Navalny, dead. The Kremlin has handpicked his opponents on this ballot, and past elections have seen many reports of ballot box stuffing and forced voting. As of now, a confident Putin is even making new nuclear threats. With me this evening to unpack the stakes of what is unfolding in Russia, former Conservative Defense Minister Jason Kenney. He's now a senior advisor at Bennett Jones, and former Liberal Defense Minister David Collenette. He's the chair of the NATO Association of Canada. Hi to you both. Pleasure to see you. Thank you very much for making the time. Mr. Kenney, I'll start with you. And just on that interview that Putin gave Russian state media this week, the big headline out of which was his comments on the nuclear threat. More specifically, he said that Moscow is ready to use nuclear weapons if there is a threat to the existence of the Russian state, but, quote, there has never been such a need. How do you read what he said and why he said it now?
Well, actually, I think most Russian observers think that the way he framed that potential use of nuclear weapons was less bellicose than the way that he's been using that threat more recklessly over the past 2 years since his invasion of Ukraine. In the past, he's basically intimated that if the West meaningfully supports Ukraine, it could lead to nuclear war. Now he's, in a sense, modified that to say only if there's a direct threat to Russian sovereignty and its existence as a nation. And most of the Russian observers I'm reading suggest that he's toned that down. I mean, it may sound incredibly bellicose to us, but he's toned it down in the Russian context because to the extent that the election in Russia this weekend is not completely rigged, he's cognizant that there is a desire for stability in Russia. There's, a lot of the Russian people do support Putin's aggression in Ukraine and generally, but none of them want to see a nuclear war. So he also qualified the remark by saying that he didn't anticipate, he didn't see any of the circumstances for that happening. The United States doesn't want to see a nuclear war. Joe Biden is a traditional politician. He's not looking to provoke that kind of situation. But let's be conscious that he uses the discourse of nuclear war, and all of his minions and spokespeople do, because there are certain people, particularly in Europe, who limit their support for Ukraine because in part of the fear that he has instilled about potential use of tactical nuclear weapons.
Well, just on that note, Mr. Collenette, there's an interesting cleavage, it appears, emerging between, in particular, Germany, but some other countries in Europe, and France. The president of France has become incredibly kind of pointed in his remarks on what he is prepared to do. A few hours ago, newspapers in France were reporting he was saying with certainty that at some point there would be French troops in Ukraine. How do you interpret that?
Well, first of all, I agree with Jason's analysis at the top there. This is a dangerous situation. Obviously, no one wants nuclear war. Vladimir Putin doesn't want nuclear war. But this is a guy, when backed into a corner, could do things that we do not anticipate. And don't forget, he made a big miscalculation 2 years ago that he didn't think that NATO, that the West would support Ukraine, would arm Ukraine, if you look at his pictures, just in the days before the invasion, he was almost like he was out of control. So when you're dealing with someone in a corner, you have to be very, very careful. On the question of Germany and France, obviously there's a big movement in Germany, the peace movement. There's also the vestiges of East Germany that the chancellor has to deal with. France is always all over the map on many things, and President Macron has not been helpful by the threat of putting French troops into Ukraine. Because if he does that, that is read by Putin as a NATO invasion, and that Article 5 then gets invoked, and we're into a war with Russia, and then that escalates, and God knows where it ends. Tactical nuclear weapons, full nuclear weapons, and we will all be gone. So I think that I agree with Jason that that Putin right now is tempering his language, but he's got a lot of hardliners he has to please, people that really would like to see him gone and be even tougher. So he's got to play to them. He's got to play to the electorate. But we can't take anything for granted.
What do you think, Mr. Kenney, is important for people at home right now watching to be looking or focusing on when it comes to the presidential election?
Well, it's a foregone conclusion. There were two candidates who were anti-war. Both of them were disqualified by the Russian Elections Commission, including Boris Nadzelka, who had hundreds of thousands of people showing up. Boris Nazadin had hundreds of thousands of people showing up across Russia to sign the petition supporting his candidacy. But the Russian Electoral Commission found that many of the signatures were invalid, of course. And of course, the assassination, the murder in prison of Alexei Navalny. So this is a foregone conclusion. I guess the only question is whether he gets 70 or 80%. This is now his fifth term that he's seeking. You may recall he had to take a timeout notionally as prime minister, but they changed the constitution to reset the clock. So he is essentially becoming a new czar. I mean, this is a continuation of the long Russian tradition of absolute power from the Tsarist era through the Soviet era. And what is sad is that Russia has never had a chance since the fall of the Soviet Union to develop its own real democratic political culture and a real opposition or a real media. And so this is accepted as a kind of normal in Russia.
Do you think that, I guess, Mr. Collenette, I wonder, what the implications are for the rest of the world as Russia wages war on Ukraine now for, entering a third year, and as his grip on power does solidify to the point of, as Mr. Kenney points out, essentially could characterize as a czar?
Well, if the U.S. Congress gives the aid that is required, and that's a big if at the moment, then Ukraine can continue to fight. The longer the fight goes on, the tougher it is for Russia. And as we know, Ukraine is making incursions into Russia on oil facilities, refineries, and that type of thing. And this is going to start to play with the ordinary people. There have already been some attacks in I think it was Rostov-on-the-Don. And of course, thousands of people have been killed, thousands of troops. And it's in a wartime economy, but the Russian people are suffering. Now, they have suffered a lot historically, and they're prepared to put up with a lot. But the longer this goes on, I think that it's tougher for Putin. So that's why we have to get our act together, and that's contingent on the small group of Republicans in the House of Representatives giving aid. So this is a situation that we haven't seen before. I'm old enough as a teenager to go through the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a real scary thing. This hasn't gotten to that stage, but it could.
Mr. Kenney, when you think about, I guess, the grip on power that Putin has relative to the positioning of the West and Ukraine, when we hear about, the delays, when we look at the delays that are taking place in the U.S. and some of the cleavages that, understandably, to a certain degree, emerge within Europe, how much of a test do you think it will continue to be for the West?
Well, a huge test, and increasingly an existential test for parts of Europe, Eastern European, particularly Baltic countries. Putin has continued to make bellicose statements about the Baltic states, about the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. And there's a reason why Poland is virtually doubling its defense expenditure to nearly 5% of GDP. They're serious. I mean, they've lived under Russian and Soviet occupation. This is not a joke for them. And their appeal to the West, to Western Europe, to the United States, to Canada, is that if we don't stop him in Ukraine, he will go further. And so it is in our collective security interests. And you know what? One thing I've pointed out to one or two of these opponents of Ukraine in the U.S. Congress is that Ukrainians, in defending their own country, have destroyed virtually half of Russia's standing army at a fractional cost to the U.S. military, like 5% of the U.S. military budget. The Americans could never have a more efficient investment in degrading the military capacity of an adversary. And finally, there's a reason why Taiwan stands by Ukraine, because they know that if Xi Jinping sees the West unwilling to stop aggression in Ukraine, it's almost an open invitation to go after Taiwan. So this is not some isolated territorial dispute in a faraway country. This is relevant to the entire global security order.
It's hard, Mr. Collenette, last word to you, though, to overstate the significance of the role the U.S. plays in all of that. I was speaking to a group of European defense attaches this week who were all saying, look, the intention would be there if the U.S. help never comes through anymore to try and backstop it. But there was an acknowledgement that they don't think they're actually capable. Nobody really can rival the defense capacity of the U.S. How important is what is unfolding there in your view?
Well, it's absolutely crucial, but this is not unique to our times. Woodrow Wilson found this challenge in the First World War, Franklin Roosevelt in the Second World War, and there's a group of people in the United States that are very insular in their mentality. They aren't aware of what is going on in the rest of the world, or they don't want to be, and they look inward. And this is a fact of life in the American political system. But certainly, it's crucial that that aid get through, and I think somehow, given the machinations or the maneuvering of the last few days in Washington, with Congressman Buck leaving and others, in fact, the Speaker, the leader of the Democrats, saying that, hinting that basically he would support a resolution that would put the vote before the members. I think that it will happen, but we're getting pretty close to the wire, and time is running out, I think, in the next few weeks.
If I could just say this,
had an impact. Yeah,
that would only happen if the Democrats agree to back up Mike Johnson if he's challenged for Speaker. So they've all got to put partisan interests aside to get this deal done.
Right, but Mr. Jeffrey said on the weekend that he more or less openly that they would do that. And so I think that at this stage, it doesn't matter about partisanship. The deal has to get done. The money has to come forward.
I'll leave it on that very significant note. Thank you very much, both of you, for a great discussion. I appreciate your insights this evening. Jason Kenney and David Collenette.